Hello YouTube, and welcome to Superpower Broadcasting. My name is Kevin Castley, and in this video, I am going to be discussing the ethics and the morality and the limits of devil's advocacy. And this is a personal subject for me. I played a lot of devil's advocate in university and high school. It helped me understand and see the perspective of our enemies. And it is an important intellectual exercise. It is a helpful thought experiment for building mental fortitude and the ability to think outside the box. However, we have a problem in our society and our civilization at large in the West. And that is that there are no longer any limits. There's no longer any quarantine of devil's advocacy. Devil's advocacy seeps through every aspect of life these days. It is no longer just about, edgy thought experiments or edgy memes or, being contrarian and thinking outside the box and, trying out, rooting for the underdog and, playing an exercise in empathy to see how your enemy feels and whatnot, so that you can get the upper hand and understand where they're coming from and use it to your advantage. No. It's gotten really bad, my friends. I spent 5 years in university, completing a double major program. I have a degree in economics and a degree in political science, and it is very, very interesting to me that, and I should clarify, it's a single degree, two majors, but I did wind up doing about 70 courses instead of 40 courses, so it was close to the equivalent of 2 actual degrees, because I took a lot of electives and studied a lot, from science to humanities and everything in between, basically. But of course, I got my majors in political science and economics. In political science, and there's a lot of devil's advocacy. I mean, the devil's advocacy, it seeps through to the point that anybody who's not convinced, anybody who's not full out anti-interventionist already, anybody who's not Noam Chomsky incarnate, basically, anybody who's not Kremlin Kyle, you get pressured into acting like you are that kind of guy, And the thing is, of course, most people, I would say probably at the university that I went to, probably about half of the political science student body was already basically Kremlin Kyle duplicates, clones of Noam Chomsky. There wasn't really any devil's advocacy going on for them because they genuinely sided with the devil. They were on the side of Vladimir Putin, Bashar the Butcher, etc. They saw them as victims of neocolonialism, imperialism, whatever buzzword you would like to throw out there. Oh, one of the most common ones, neoliberalism. I mean, wow, because as you know, if you watch this program, right, I am not a neoliberal. I despise a lot of neoliberalism. Neoliberalism puts money over morals. Neoliberals trade with communist China. Neoliberals will make deals with North Korea so that they can make a buck. I'm a neoconservative. I believe in spreading democracy worldwide, even if it costs money in the short run, because in the long run it will make more money. I have no interest in trading with anti-democratic countries. Neoliberals say, are they a democracy? Are they communists? Are they fascists? I don't care. Let's just make a trade deal. No, that's weak. That's weak. They're negotiation cocks, right? I'm a neocon. I'm not a neolib. So, but of course they use all those buzzwords without really understanding what it even means, right? Because, of course, their definition of neoliberalism is a lot more closer to neoconservatism. It's basically neoconservatism coupled with free market ideology, right? They don't really properly define neoliberalism. They don't really conceive of neoliberalism as how it actually is, which is a blend of the welfare state with free marketism domestically and an emphasis on diplomacy and trade internationally as opposed to military interventionism. So neoliberals, they will make deals with genocide mongers, warmongers, etc. around the world, despots, just to make a quick buck. They believe that economic reform will result from it and that you can change countries around. And they'll cite, communist China as an example. And they'll see that in many ways as a victory. And I look at that and I say, well, even if I gave you the benefit of the doubt and said that their economic reform was genuine, to some extent it was, though Xi has curtailed it recently, they never socially reformed. They never politically reformed. So the best that the neoliberals can ever offer you is that some of these dictatorships will economically reform to become more capitalist. Okay, but what about the human rights? What about morality? What about good in the world? Right? I mean, come on. Money doesn't matter that much. Money matters. Economics matter. Don't get me wrong. Don't get me wrong. That is not the path. That is not the path to prosperity. That is the path to doom. That is the path to defeat. That is the path to acquiescing and eventually being defeated by our enemies as they conquer Eurasia and later go on to conquer the Americas in several centuries. They will defeat America and the West if we allow ourselves to legitimize and trade with these people. They are our enemies, and we must meet them as such. And it is inappropriate to trade with communist China until they are no longer communist. So we must move those factories to India. That's my view. So now, of course, I do not play devil's advocate anymore. And I'll get into this, but I'm just giving you a sense of how the mainstream view at my university was. It basically consisted of a few tenets. War bad, asterisk. What's the asterisk? The asterisk is, unless fascist Russia, communist China, North Korea, all these other countries are doing it. War's only bad if America does it. Another caveat. Imperialism bad, asterisk. What's the asterisk? The asterisk is, imperialism is defined as the United States doing anything in the world. So if Russia annexes Crimea, it's not imperialist. They were fighting neocolonialism. If communist China goes into the South China Sea, it's their sphere of influence. But let's say that America tries to boot Russian soldiers out of Venezuela and take out Maduro. Oh no, that's an evil, no good USA imperialism. Look at that. The USA, the evil neocons and neolibs. Pathetic. Pathetic. Cringe. I spent like 5 years in this kind of environment, my hawks. Yeah, so they have other bunk and junk talking points. But you see where I'm going. You see the environment of academia that I wish to convey to you, that this is what it's like. And the thing is, if you are not in that cringe crowd, if you're not in the clown crowd, what are you going to do? Well, most people go along with it. Most people don't think too much about it. Most people, they take the path of least resistance. They write the papers that see the world through that sort of perspective. And they try to appeal to their professors' sensibilities so that they can get those A's to go to law school and I guess make a bunch of money. And of course to that, because I no longer play devil's advocate like that, I would say, what's the point in having all that money if you've sold yourself out to immorality and to defending brutal despots, unironically? I mean, come on. So a lot of them are unironic. I did a lot of devil's advocacy too. A lot of my friends at university were just isolationists. Basically, all my friends that were in political programs and stuff were anti-interventionists. And I've always been a hawk, but I didn't come out publicly as a hawk until my last year of university. because I got sick of it, like I wanted to maintain friendships, all that sort of stuff, I played a lot of devil's advocacy. I viewed it as, I really want to see how these people think. I want to see their perspective. I mean, when I was in high school, I hung out with people that are basically the traditional definition of National Socialists. I hung out with people that are, fascists and whatnot. I also hung out with communists, like actual unironic communists, like Marxists and stuff that voted for the Communist Party. Like, not even kidding. Like, I spent time in various circles. When I was much younger, when I was in high school, I considered myself a democratic socialist. But I did a lot of devil's advocacy and stuff, and I was really trying to figure out, for sure, I was trying to figure out, my politics and stuff, because on economics I was more left wing, and so I had kind of taken a break from really having that much in the way of hawkish views and stuff, because my hawkish views were founded on, social liberalism and whatnot, but almost everybody I knew was conservative to various extents. And so I tried to understand their perspective, and I'll do videos on, understanding their perspective, various perspectives. Because one of the big misconceptions that's out there is that communists are like big liberals or whatever. It's like, no, they're not. They hate liberals. They hate liberalism. They're actually pretty conservative. I mean, you can look at the Soviet Union. It was a pretty conservative country. Heck, look at any communist system in the world. North Korea, Cuba, communist China, Vietnam, Laos. They're all deeply conservative, very conservative countries. They just happen to be very economically left wing, and so I was economically left wing back then. But I came out, of course, as a hawk in my senior year, and it was interesting. Like, obviously, there were other people there that weren't. I wouldn't characterize as hawks, but they weren't anti-interventionists. They were more like the Samantha Power types. They were, responsibility to protect types, except they would cloud it in caveats of, but, Iraq war bad and this and that. Like, the assumption was the Iraq war was bad everywhere. And I always thought, well, how can you believe in the responsibility to protect if you're going to criticize everything with 2020 hindsight? Like, obviously, anybody would say that any intervention looks good, and then it runs into problems, right? And then, it's easy to criticize the problems afterwards. It's like, of course, every war has fog to it. There's a fog to every war. The question is the status quo after better than it was before? In the case of Iraq, it's not even close. Saddam murdered 1.5 million people. I mean, a few 100,000 died in the war, and a lot of those were due to Iranian insurgents. That wasn't like the U.S. killed them or anything. That was Iran. It was Iranian terrorism. And that only happened because the U.S. refused to liberate Iran at the same time. If the U.S. had taken out Iran and Iraq at the same time, there wouldn't have been that Iranian insurgency, because their state would have been crippled. It would have been liberated. The Ayatollah would be 6 feet under. So they couldn't have meddled in Iraq. And it would have been a single front war from Afghanistan to the border with Syria. However, you see this, of course. You see this talking point. It is a junk talking point that war bad. And you really, if you're in that culture where everybody agrees, you try to, and you know that that's dumb, but you also want to keep your friendships, and you want to, not rock the boat too much. So you play devil's advocate. Now, devil's advocacy, as I mentioned, I feel personally that if I had always been a hawk and just always wrote hawk papers and stuff and everything, that my hawk arguments might be weaker. They might be weaker. Sure, my convictions and everything would be unchanged, but my ability to understand where the enemy is coming from would be greatly diminished, because there are hawks out there that I've spoken to that have said, that have told me, they don't necessarily understand the perspective of their enemy, right? And of course, it doesn't matter, because whether or not you understand the perspective of the enemy, like Vladimir Putin and whatnot, it doesn't matter. He's still the enemy. It's not like once you understand their perspective, you go easy on them. It's like, no, in my case, I understand their perspective. 100%. And it's made me even more resolute in opposing them. I understand exactly how Kim Jong-il thinks. I understand exactly how Kim Jong-un thinks. I understand their supporters. I understand that they think of things in terms of their own personal survival, all that sort of stuff, you know. I understand their interests, their imperatives. I understand Iran. I understand what they do. I understand that the Ayatollah of Iran has to fund terrorism in the Middle East, because if he doesn't, oil prices will go down. And if oil prices go down, he can no longer draw oil at a profit. If he can't draw at a profit, 80% of his government revenue comes from oil. He will not be able to pay the people's pensions or food stamps or anything. They will come to his palace and they will do to him what they did to Gaddafi, maybe with a longer bayonet, and demand economic reprieve from the chaos. So I know that he has to fund terrorism to cause chaos. That's their objective. The same way that Saudi Arabia and the U.S. have to bring about stability to keep oil prices low. These are the opposing interests, right? Opposing forces. Saudi Arabia and the U.S. go into the Middle East to create stability, to bring oil prices down so that they can get cheaper oil because it serves them economically. Russia and Iran do the exact opposite. They go into the Middle East to cause chaos, to bring oil prices up, because if oil prices fall too low, they get murdered. Their leaders get murdered. I understand their perspective. I understand why they fund terrorism. Is that going to make me have any sympathy? Is that going to make me say, hey, maybe we shouldn't take out Iran? They're just doing what they have to. No, because they fund terrorism. They're our enemy. They're our enemy, and we must destroy them. Understanding why they do what they do lets you use that to your advantage. It lets you, devil's advocacy, it lets you tease out the Achilles heels in your opponent's arguments. Devil's advocacy in that sense is a useful intellectual exercise. But we must bear in mind the bounds of reason, that devil's advocacy must be used as an intellectual exercise to understand the opponent and to gain the upper hand and to tease out these Achilles heels. But it cannot be used ad nauseum. It cannot be used without limitations. It cannot become your worldview. Because there are people out there where their worldview just basically consists of being edgy and contrarian. That's their entire worldview. Well, what do you have to say? What do you have to answer for your life? I mean, come on. If all that you ever do is play devil's advocacy, eventually you become the devil. And that's a line that I will repeat throughout my program, of course, that I say in many videos. That's one of the pieces of wisdom, if I had to impart to my viewers. If you could take away, only a few tenets from my life experience, I would say, that is one of them right there, is that if you conduct devil's advocacy your whole life, at some point, you do become the devil. It becomes indistinguishable, right? So you do have to stand for your convictions. You do have to be genuine. You do have to be unironic at some point. And you must come out and you must uphold morality and good in the world. And devil's advocacy allows us a powerful tool to undermine evil by really seeing, and undermine. It allows us to see their perspective, these thought experiments of, what if they're doing this, or, well, what if they're the good guys, or what if they're just doing this because of X, and so on and so forth. And then you really realize at the end of the day that their state, that their reason, their raison d'etre, right, that it's actually evil. It is founded upon a flawed, well, I wouldn't say flawed, it's founded upon a malicious set of tenets. And I'll give you an example. I'll give you two examples. I'll give you the example of the USSR versus the USA in the Cold War. So I'm interested in the Cold War. I've always been interested in the Cold War. And so, it's human in us that we like to root for the underdog in sports and everything else. And so I wrote a number of papers, defending the Soviet perspective and trying to figure out, their perspective on things, why they did what they did, stoking tensions in Vietnam, going into Afghanistan, for example, sending tanks into Hungary and Czechoslovakia, all these other areas. And what was one of the conclusions that I came to with respect to the tanks in and Hungary and Czechoslovakia. Well, and I did a lot of research and everything. Well, it was so that they could maintain and uphold their buffer, because they had seen what happened in World War II, where Hitler had invaded them and slaughtered 28 million Soviet people. And they refused to allow that to happen again. And the thing is, now you might say, well, that actually sounds like a good motivation on their part. They have that buffer to protect their people. But no, that's not it. That's not it. It was so that they could protect their industrial heartland, so that they could keep their economic output up. It was so that they could protect their capital, in other words, their own butts. And it was so that they could ultimately establish an empire over Eastern Europe. And they came up with, the spheres of influence theory, the idea that, this is ours and that's yours. And if you respect us here, we'll respect you there. That's one of the big devil's advocate sort of arguments that you could make for the Soviet Union. You could say, well, it's wrong for America to prod at them because that's their territory. The problem in all of this, of course, is that the fundamental assumptions that this rests on is that the only people that matter in the USSR and all of those other countries are the party bosses in Moscow, because all these fundamental foundational precepts, they assume that the agents that matter are the party bosses, because it essentially amounts to a false equivalence. And the modern example of this is after the Soviet Union fell apart, what did we see? Well, NATO went in, and NATO expanded into countries such as Romania, Poland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and others, which, per the agreement between Gorbachev and I believe it was H.W. Bush, there was an informal agreement that NATO wouldn't expand eastward. And so the Stephen Cohens of the world, if you were to play devil's advocate and make the Stephen Cohen case, Stephen, Russia good, USA bad, Cohen, he goes on Russia Today all the time and unironically defends this, but it's basically, it's a devil's advocate talking point. What does he say? Well, he says that America betrayed Russia. America betrayed that agreement by expanding, and so therefore America's at fault for the new Cold War. That the Russians, if they just left the Russians to have their own sphere of influence, it would have been fine. Well, here's the problem with that. America did not go in by force and enslave the populations of Eastern Europe and force them to be a part of NATO. In fact, the reality of the matter is, those countries of Eastern Europe begged, they implored, they pleaded to become part of NATO. Why? Because they wanted protection from the evil empire of fascist Russia. Fascist Russia, on the other hand, back when it was communist USSR, when they went in and took those countries and incorporated them into the Warsaw Pact, they did it by force. They used the Red Army. Those populations had no say in the matter. See, that's the fundamental difference. So when Stephen Cohen says, well, Russia was betrayed, no, he means some elite oligarchs and their political leadership in Moscow got screwed over. That's a good thing, because the peoples, hundreds of millions of people of Eastern Europe, like a couple 100 million people, have agency now. They have national self-determination. They have the opportunity for freedom, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, which they didn't have before. The world is a better place. It is a more stable place. It is a more democratic place. It is a more virtuous place. It is a more prosperous place. The devil's advocate argument ignores all of that, and it just simply says, well, how do the Russians see it? Well, no. How does Moscow see it? And, and again, it's an important exercise. You want to see how they see things, but we cannot get deluded. We cannot allow ourselves to get deluded into allowing those arguments that should be used to tease out weaknesses in our enemy to lead us to adopt the worldview of our enemy. That is when devil's advocacy goes from being a powerful tool for good to becoming a degenerate practice, in which case you flood yourself and infest yourself with cognitive dissonance. And this cognitive dissonance applies universally. You see this all the time with the progressives, for example. They are a bundle of contradictions. They are an infestation of cognitive dissonance. They go around and espouse women's rights, gay rights, equality of opportunity, all these various things that sound great. But then when you ask them, well, but do Afghan women have those rights? What will they say? They'll say, oh, we have no business being in Afghanistan. That's a evil, no good USA imperialism, because that's actually the Taliban's territory, and that's their culture. They oppress women. So who are we to say anything else? Oh, it's so bunk. The cultural relativism, the moral relativism, oh, so weak. There are objective goods in the world, and there are objective evils in the world. This is fundamental. This isn't rocket science. It's not rocket science to figure out that Afghan women have dignity too, that it's not just women born in California or New York that deserve rights. Oh, but the women in Afghanistan don't. I mean, come on. I mean, it's insulting. It's deplorable. It's disgusting. California has about 40 million people, say, for example. Afghanistan, a little over 30 million people. So if you're a woman in California and you're all like, oh yeah, I'm all about women's rights, I'm all about this stuff, but let's not have any women's rights for Afghan women. Let's pull out. Let's withdraw. We have no business being over there. It's been too long. Hashtag end the endless wars. Hashtag Tulsi 2020. Well, guess what? Yeah, sure, it's easy to say that because you happen to be born in America. If we re-roll the die, you have, a 40% chance of being born in Afghanistan versus California. Let's say you roll those odds. Really? You want to be born in the Taliban territory? Then, my guess is things ain't going to feel so great. And you're actually going to have resentment towards those, cosmopolitan, self-righteous women in California that would argue to withdrawal from Afghanistan. You would say, how could you leave us? The Taliban only has 13% currently of the territory. How could you leave us? How could you support Bernie Sanders? How could you support Tulsi Gabbard? How could you support these people who want to who want to grab and consume defeat from the clutches of victory? They're so close, and yet they want to hand over everything to the Taliban. They want to forfeit everything. They want all those thousands of Americans to have died in vain, thousands of Canadians and coalition forces to have died in vain, hundreds of thousands of Afghan security personnel to have died in vain, just so that we can hand it back to the tyranny of the Taliban. No, it is deplorable. It's disgusting. We cannot condemn our fellow humans to suffering such as this. And this devil's advocacy, this has infested our society, as it has infested our civilization, and it has gone from being a tool which we quarantine to intellectual exercise to consuming our lives and becoming part of our worldview, where everything is edgy and everything is, it's hip, and everything is, 4chan-y and internet type, where it's all like, oh yeah, war's bad, and that's their territory, and who are we to say that we're the good guys, and let's not world police and all this stuff. And I mean, without taking a step back and saying, how would I feel if I happened to be born in those countries? It's the most selfish, it's the most deplorable, it's the most, what's the word I'm looking for? It's the most morally duplicitous outlook that you could have towards international relations. And it applies in all things these days. Oh yeah, let's do something that hurts us to own the libs, or let's do something that hurts us to own the establishment. Let's lick the boots of the communist Chinese establishment to own our establishment. Spoiler, our establishment is better than theirs. You might not like our establishment. It's got problems. Guess what? Their establishment has orders of magnitude more problems. So you're cringe and fringe for going in that direction. See, this is the thing. It is a cringe worldview when you allow devil's advocacy to become your worldview, when you're always rooting for the underdog. The North Korea example is another one that I will give. What's the devil's advocate position on North Korea? Well, the devil's advocate would say, well, Kim, look at him. He's surrounded. He's surrounded. He's got to do what he's got to do. He has to build up those nukes. He doesn't have a choice, because if he doesn't build them up, then it's the end of his regime. So he has to do it, and we should understand that, right? He's got to do what he's got to do, and we should understand that, they don't want war. Kim doesn't want war. He wants to be left alone, and so we should leave him alone and stop acting like the aggressor. That's the devil's advocate position, right? That's the general overview of it. Okay, well, it allows us to understand, yes, he does have to build up those nukes. We understand. He doesn't have a choice. He has to do it. Otherwise, he doesn't have the deterrent, and he's facing imminent demise, right, any day. So he has to do it. We get that. And we can use that to our advantage 100%. We know then to look for things. We know to look for uranium enrichment. We know when we figure these things out, we know that we can be confident that when he comes to the negotiating table, he's acting in bad faith, because he doesn't even have a choice. He has to build up those nukes. So devil's advocacy, it's good in that sense. It's something that states department officials should practice regularly in a quarantine situation in which it doesn't spill over into their actual identity, right? We have to be careful with it. Devil's advocacy, it's a toxic substance. You can think of it like plutonium-239. Plutonium-239, powerful tool, very powerful tool for destroying your enemies, as fascist Japan found out at Nagasaki back in 1945. Very powerful tool. You can ask them how Fat Man turned out, right? Didn't work out too well for them. They surrendered, right? Likewise, devil's advocacy, very potent, very toxic. We need to be careful with it. You wouldn't just handle plutonium-239 with your bare hands and eat it and drink it and consume it. No, you would die of radiation poisoning. You would get sick. Your hair would fall out. Many bad things would happen to you. Your cells would denature. Your cells would die. You would die. It would be the end of you. See, that's what happens when you play around with plutonium-239. But we have to process it. We have to manipulate it. We have to alter the atomic structure. We have to do all these things to it. Well, how do we do that? Well, simple. We set up a laboratory. We get out, thick gloves to manipulate it. We put our hands into those gloves. We have solid glass, many layers to protect from gamma, alpha, beta particles coming off. And then we can play around with very delicate tools and everything and manipulate the ball of uranium and do all that sort of stuff with it, as they do when they produce nuclear weaponry, right? You have to be careful with it. Well, likewise, on a spiritual level, on an emotional level, on an intellectual level, on a moral level, we can think of devil's advocacy in a similar way. We have to be conscious that when we're doing it, that we're doing an exercise to see how our enemies feel. And we have to bear that in mind, and we have to bear in mind all of the contradictions that arise and all of the fundamental values that we hold. And if we lose sight of this, we allow ourselves to be consumed by the logic of devil's advocacy to where it overpowers and conceals our fundamental values. And so in the case of North Korea, for example, what's the fundamental value here that was overlooked by that? Well, the fundamental value was that people that are born in North Korea have as much dignity as those who are born in North Dakota. And the Kim dynasty is a brutal dictatorship that has killed between 5 and 8 million of their own people so that they could plunder and have absolute power. So when we see that, he's doing this because he feels threatened, and if we went in there, it would be the end of his regime, so he has to build up nukes. What we miss in that is that it's a morally good thing to see the end of his regime. That's actually a good thing, and we must bear in mind that we are fighting the North Korean regime. We're not on their side. We want to understand how they think, because if you go into a war and you don't understand your enemy, that's a problem. That's going to spell issues, right? But we also cannot let that devil's advocacy slip into our personal identity. We have to constantly bear in mind that when we come to these conclusions and we make these logical inferences on how our enemies are conducting themselves, we understand the whole time that these are bad actors. These are these are the axis of evil. I was going to say bad guys, but again, they're not bad guys. If you say they're bad guys, it means you know nothing. You don't understand how evil their regimes are. They are evil. They are the axis of evil, and we must bear that in mind. So when we play devil's advocacy, we must be very careful to not allow that to spill over and consume us. It's like you can get possessed by the devil, basically, is how that works, right? I mean, yeah, and I see this all the time in university. You see people who from high school, I can speak to this personally, who from high school went from wanting to change the world, doing all the volunteer work and everything, and helping out people and everything, to going to university and getting pilled by their professors on Noam Chomsky stuff, to where they went from somebody who might have originally supported an organization like Liberty in North Korea or all these other things, to now saying the USA's bad and Bolton's bad and they're all a bunch of warmongers and they're just doing it because of military contracts. They lose sight of the fact that even if that's true, military contracts are still better than a country of enslavement, right? So even if the U.S. only liberated North Korea out of financial interest, guess what? That's still better than not liberating North Korea out of moral degeneracy. So yes, at the end of the day, the implications, the effects matter. And we must bear this in mind, that if we as humans, right, we all have agency. If we mess around with these sorts of intellectual exercises, we have to bear in mind the potency which they carry. Yeah, it can be fun. It can be edgy, post some edgy memes or whatever, ironically be a tanky for a day or something like that, but I'm telling you, 100%, if you play devil's advocacy long enough and continuously, without taking a step back, without thinking to yourself, without reassuring yourself of your identity and your values, without remembering the light of what it means to stand for humanity, you do at some point become the devil. And what happens, say for example, if you die and you've been playing devil's advocacy your whole life? That means that your entire life, your entire intellectual life was spent being edgy and being contrarian and conducting apologetics on behalf of evil people. That's your legacy. That's it. It's game over. That's your life. That's what you have to show for. Whether you're an atheist, whether you're religious or whatnot, we are all aware that, you get one shot at this. You get one life. I mean, again, we have one life. Whether you are religious and you believe in eternity, or you're an atheist and you believe in, say, the heat death of the universe or whatnot, and that consciousness ceases the moment you die. In either case, you get one shot. So your life has great value to it. Do you want to spend your life playing devil's advocate ad nauseum? Or do you want to spend your life free from toxicity, free from cognitive dissonance, and live according to moral universalism and understanding that humans of all nations and all lands have dignity, and that we must go about seeking a better world to live in, that the status quo is bad and that it can be improved upon worldwide, that we should fight and challenge the evildoers in the world, the axis of evil. The axis of evil is not an axis of bad dudes. It is an axis of evil. It is literal evil. And if you consider my language here hyperbolic, you should read The Republic of Fear. You should read, for example, The Great Leader and the Fighter Pilot. You should read Escape from Camp 14. You should read all these books that have been written by people who actually lived in these regimes. And you should understand that, yes, it is in our nature to root for the underdog. But we must bear in mind that, well, it might look like Kim is the underdog and America is this powerful aggressor. No, he is the overlord, the slaver of North Korea. It is the people of North Korea who are the underdog. And we must side with them, just as in all other oppressed nations. And we must eschew devil's advocacy as an ad nauseum practice. And we must ultimately come to the conclusion and the foundation that humanity has dignity and our values are universal, and that we are on the side of good, and we must fight our enemies with all means necessary. And yes, that includes devil's advocacy to assist us in our efforts, but we must quarantine it, we must use it where appropriate, and we must use it in a compartmentalized manner where when you cease to do that, you go back to being you. You don't maintain that edgy contrarianism and carry the cognitive dissonant burden around with you, because we will all be healthier for it, and we will all be better off, and we can make the world a better place together, my hawks. So I'm done with the devil. So thank you for watching.